Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm joined tonight by Art Costa. And our broad topic, I guess, is how to make our city and our region more resilient in these times. But on a more specific level, Art is the founder and president of Thames Valley Sustainable Connections, and we'll talk about some of the specific things that organization is doing to contribute to area resiliency. Sure. So welcome, Art. Welcome back.
Great to be here.
And I guess, this is maybe a walk down memory lane, but maybe you can talk for a couple minutes about the origins of Thames Valley Sustainable Connections. It's been around for about a decade now.
Yeah, sure. Well, we started out through a combination of things. One had to do with, I actually came out of my run for city council. It's all your fault.
But I will take the blame or credit happily.
take the credit. But from that, I was really concerned about platform. What was it that a city like New London, where were the issues, what needed, what was needed. And so out of that came, how do we do property tax reform and so forth. But along with that, I was thinking about how do we create a more vibrant commercial environment in New London with local businesses. That is, independent, locally owned businesses, knowing that the big boxes and chains were beginning to swallow up our main street and our cities, and so that's when what was called Renew London Council was formed on those two ideas. And mixed in there was Jane Jacobs. So it all kind of blended very nicely, since the Local First movement and BALI, Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, were both based on a lot of the Jane Jacobs notions of economic development. So that's kind of the origins, and as you may recall, it was called Renew London Council. And we thought that was kind of a nifty name. Not to be confused. Sometimes people thought I and others were counselors or whatever, and that wasn't the idea at all. But over time, we transformed into a mission of resiliency. That is, how to build community resiliency, and that became kind of our tagline and mission statement. And with that came a name change, Thames Valley Place, Thames Valley Sustainable, so we were very interested in all kinds of sustainability for the long term and not just quick, turnaround things. And connections, how do we connect our region, our watershed, our people, our culture, and so forth in a way that really makes the most out of the diversity which is natural to this area. So that was kind of the beginning. I mean, it took a few years to get from Renew London Council to Thames Valley Sustainable Connections.
Well, I think part of the thinking behind this shift was the first couple initiatives were based very closely in the city of New London. But I think there was an increasing realization that New London can't thrive in a vacuum.
Exactly.
So we had to connect with the region, really, because, we're 5.5 square miles and 27,000 people. We can't do it by ourselves.
Exactly. There is no island, no one, and no city is an island unto itself. So we expanded, at least in terms of our thinking, about more of a regional, more of a bioregion, rather than simply, which we kind of said the geography of Thames Valley Sustainable Connections followed the Thames River, but touched the Lass Green Valley, which is north of Norwich for sure, but it goes into Massachusetts. And so that was our intent, was to say, okay, they've kind of covered that area, but down in southeastern Connecticut, we need to have something similar that begins to really make those connections and build on our natural as well as our built environments in southeastern Connecticut.
Now, you mentioned that the mission became more slanted towards resiliency in many areas. So how would you define resiliency?
Well, the real short version of that is resiliency is the ability to bounce back from disruption. And so disruption can come in a number of forms. Certainly, we think in terms of climate change, sea level rises, all those things we don't have a whole lot of control over. We did maybe, but these things are happening, they're in process, and we now have to think about mitigating. How do we adapt to it and deal with some of the facts as they're kind of rushing toward us? But beyond that, or part of that, is also disruptions that can happen in everyday life, whether it's opioids, whether it's suicide rates climbing, whether it's children being shot in school. These are all the ability to be resilient and to deal with these disruptions that can be just life-changing, are really what we're talking about with resiliency.
With the examples you brought up, it almost seems as though we're in the middle of a crisis of resiliency right now.
I would say that. Yeah, it's definitely all over, and it's hitting in a whole bunch of different areas, and I don't think anybody's got a complete handle on it, which is all the more reason why we need to be prepared from as early an age as possible in terms of preparing people, not just for the workforce, but for living and thriving, not just simply existing, but how can we thrive in a situation that's tumultuous and where we need to be able to bounce back from the unexpected. How do we re-knit our communities so that they respond positively as we have to work together and with each other to.
And it's interesting to me too that we need to, I guess, in order to be sustainable, we have to be kind of efficient about it, because we have learned, which we didn't know maybe 50 years ago, that some resources are finite.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you go back 125, 150 years, whatever it was, when Eureka oil was found, and back then, when even this country seemed endless, there was no such thing as a limit. It was like we had endless resources. Oil, you just poke the drill in the ground and up it came. And we've learned that's not really the case, as we've had to move offshore to dangerous areas in order to extract fossils and blow up mountaintops, and wherever it is, we keep moving. And so, many people have come to the realization, certainly geologists and scientists have come to this, but the public at large, that this is not an endless, cornucopia of goodies that
right.
we have
Even
here.
if we're not running out of the oil, it takes more and more resources to extract it to where you don't really get an energy gain out of it.
Yeah, you have something called net energy, which is that point at which you have to expend more energy to extract the energy, and then it becomes financially just totally, worthless. You just cap those oil wells and move on. So even if there's oil or gas in the ground, the cost and the quality of what's coming out is then the big issue. If we have to take tar sands oil from Canada, what does that mean? Because now we're not drilling; we're actually mining for oil, and the process for that oil is extensive. So there's a huge cost in moving it and processing it that is much greater than days when the oil gushers happened and most of the oil and gas was pure and high quality.
Yeah, and cheap. I remember 30 cents a gallon gasoline.
Right. Yeah.
Thames Valley Sustainable Connections has an event coming up in
Yes.
2 days.
Yeah.
And it's pretty exciting, and it's about resiliency. So do you want to talk about it?
Sure. Yeah, this is going to be a full day at Lyman Allen Art Museum and the auditorium. And in fact, on the screen is how you can register if you're interested. We still have some seats at tbsci.org, or you can give me a call. But on that website, you can click on symposium registration, and it'll take you right there. And it's a very easy registration process. But this really is something that came out of a number of conversations. And there was a study done here a couple of years ago along the whole shoreline area, which included southeastern Connecticut, but it went all the way, maybe to Fairfield County, but certainly over to the Madison and the western shoreline. And the individual who did that was Adam Wexel, and he is the director of science at the National,
It's a nature conservancy, right?
Yeah, Nature Conservancy, right. And I mean, he has years of experience, but he brings with him not just the years, but the exposure to like 20 some countries throughout the world. He was just down in Puerto Rico and did a lot of work down there with as a result of the hurricane that devastated that area. And we're very fortunate to have him come back to the southeastern Connecticut and to be our keynote speaker. So this is going to be pretty exciting, and he's going to frame the whole day. As I say, it's a whole day. Check-in is at 8:30 to 9, and then we have the mayor giving the welcome remarks, and then Adam takes it from there. And I've seen his presentation, and it's really incredible. It's well worth going to Lyman Allen just for that. But on top of that, we have 5 panels. And as I mentioned, when you look at resiliency in a broader way and not just the environment or just climate change, it is the environment, but it's not just a response to climate change, but all kinds of disruptions. So we have a panel on health, everything from early childhood development through to some of those things I mentioned, like the opioid, but also just the life expectancies of Americans, which was one of the highest. And now, particularly white males are living shorter lives. In fact, African American and white males' lifespans are starting to narrow. Maybe it's better for the African Americans, or maybe doing a bit better, but I think a lot of it is because of both the addiction health issue and as well as suicides, which may or may not be tied to addiction, but nevertheless depression and so forth. So these are environmental health issues that will be addressed in a way that has some answers but a discussion around that. And there's a program at the Continuing Ed here in New London that we've been very supportive of, and it's called Even Start. Maybe you've heard of it?
I heard of Even Start years and years and
Okay.
years and years ago.
It's always one of those that needs funding, and the state sometimes, and sometimes it. But in any case, I was really interested in it some years ago because it was bringing mother and child together, and some basics of child development, conversation, reading, of course, and these things that help a child brain develop and readiness to go to school. So it's a program I'd like to see expanded, and maybe Head Start it picks up some of this as well, but this is where it all begins. I mean, if we're going to have people that are able to be resilient, then they have to have these fundamental.
That's interesting to me because I did work for Head Start for many years, and from the mid 1990s to like 2007, 12 years I worked in a home-based Head Start program, which had a lot in common, I think, with Even Start. It was working with the parents and children together, but we didn't at the time have any programs for children younger than 3 years old. And as you and I know, most brain development happens from birth to 5. So if you're not starting till 3, you're starting late.
Right.
And I hope to see that funded. The home-based program that I worked at has sort of shrunk.
Right.
But I'm glad to see some other programs sprouting up.
Yeah, and if there's a way that this symposium can help to make people aware of it and the value of it. In that panel, we're not only going to have a couple of people who help develop and run it, but also a graduate of it, that is a woman whose child, and so these are people that are relatively young mothers who are getting their GED, and at the same time the child is kind of staying there, but the mother then kind of joins the child, and together they learn. And so we're going to learn about that, and from somebody who graduated from
great.
that, which is nice. Yeah.
And children's mental health and brain development is great, but I worry about things like kids' physical fitness too. I don't know if many people know this. I mean, people probably all know that I've been doing stuff with Riverside Park for quite a while. But I think a lot of people don't know how I got started with that. I don't live in that neighborhood. And the reason I got started with it was that, Riverside Park abuts Winthrop School. Right. And I was on the Board of Education the last year the Winthrop School was a neighborhood school. And when we looked at statistics from schools' achievement, and everyone was worried, New London kids' reading level isn't up to snuff, and their math level isn't where it should be. Well, it was actually their fitness level that was awful. The 4th grade physical fitness test, I think statewide, about a third of the 4th graders could pass the test. And in Winthrop School, when it was a neighborhood school, fewer than 2%.
Yeah.
And you thought, these are people living in places that they don't have backyards, and they can't just send the kids out to play. Mm-hmm. And it's like, these kids need open space.
Right, absolutely. It's hard. People say, well, times have changed, but it's still hard to grasp the idea that natural play isn't natural anymore. It's got to be organized and overseen and so forth. I mean, it just in terms of creativity, learning, and socialization, all those things that are so important to development is just kind of being isolated, and kids are now spending more time kind of friending or doing whatever in social, the social networking stuff. But in any case, you're absolutely right, I think, that the physical health is as important as the mental health. They
It's
go
all together.
And so we need to really be focused on that. It's amazing, I think, what we could prevent if we started young. In fact, I would say even prenatal is when you really need to start,
True.
and then right on through. And there are programs, there's some interesting programs, I can't remember what it's called now, that deals with older children in terms of resiliency. This HOTS, the higher order thinking.
Oh, yeah.
That too, I was hoping to have some of that in here, but I wasn't able to make the connection. But that kind of integration, I'm
Yeah, bringing the arts into the schools.
bringing the arts in, but right, and it does help to build that resiliency. So we have that, but we also have some detailed discussion on some of the health issues that plague us all, at least nationally as well as locally, and so that will be addressed, as well as some of the other human impact in terms of resiliency and our environmental challenges. So that'll be the health. So again, we're just trying to make sure we've covered not only the usual, but the next one is a little more on the usual side, which is energy. And the energy is going to be interesting. That is really going to deal with not just renewable energies, but also microgrids, which can or may not be renewable, but obviously like to see a more renewable. But right. Nevertheless, they are the beginning of decentralizing your grid to deal with disruptions. So when we have right. intensive storms come in, what happens to an area in terms of outage? I mean, our first reaction is cut the trees down. We'll get rid of the trees, and that'll take care of the lines.
We in New London have seen way too much of that.
Yeah, and we cut these trees down, and it's amazing. But that's the knee-jerk reaction to, okay, the tree fell on the wires. Well, I don't know, but if you become overly conscious of these things, and sometimes I think I'm a little too sensitive, I start looking at these wires, and I start saying, Mike, look what we've done to our environment here with all of these wires. Why isn't there a better way to connect people without, this? In the 21st century, we should right. be further along in this. But in any case, so that'll be a big part of the discussion. Green Bank, so how to finance some of this, and we've, as I mentioned, microgrids and energy. The person who's going to be running this, that particular panel will Jess Leclerc comes from the Sustainable Connecticut, which New London is signed on to do. Bob, I know, has been active in that, and so we hope to move towards a bronze or gold or whatever we move to. But I know that there's an effort to really make this work. So she'll be there, and she kind of runs the program within the Sustainable Energy Institute, which is part of Eastern Connecticut University. Anyway, so that's going to be very interesting.
I love the idea of decentralizing, because I think that our centralized generation, the big nuclear power plants or the big trash to energy plants, I think the only real advantage of them is the profit motive. When you have it centralized, some investor will have almost a monopoly on it and have a lot of ability to make money. But the infrastructure we require is probably a lot more elaborate, having just generation in very few locations.
Right, and it makes us vulnerable. And while Puerto Rico should stand as an example, it may be much worse because of how it has, it is a territory of the United States, which means that we're responsible for how well that infrastructure is operating during an intensive storm. But that's a good example of a brittle system, and we may not be quite that brittle, but we're fairly brittle. And so that needs some attention in order to be resilient when it comes to intensive storms, which we know happen. And some of these storms are not 1938 storms. They're intense, but it's as much our infrastructure as it is the storm that creates all the havoc. Then we've got a group on transportation, but very specifically bicycles. And so Karen Jenkins, who is she's working with the New Haven Mayor's Task Force, but she's with the national, I think she's a former president of the National Bicycle Organization, encouraging and more and more use of the bicycle as a means of transportation, not just as a means of exercise or fun and so forth, though that too, but how to make urban environments in particular much more accommodating. And it's interesting. I was watching the Connecticut state channel there, the Connecticut cable thing, and she was on it. So, and she was talking about making some really great points, and they had the DOT head on there too, and they're talking about a lot of things, and some of it's happening. It's just I don't know that it's happening throughout the state. A lot of talk about the corridor between New Haven and Hartford, which is nice, but so what happens over here in eastern Connecticut?
And even the city of New London, I know we've had Bike New London here for quite a long time, but most of the roads are not really conducive to cycling. Right. I was a bicycle commuter for about 15 years when I lived in Waterford and worked in New London. And when I moved to New London, well, at first I could just walk to work because I lived 3 blocks from the hospital, but it really did not feel comfortable to ride a bike the way it had when I was, riding on Great Neck Road.
Right.
Or even some of the busier streets in Waterford, even though Waterford isn't really that set up for bicycling, but New London seemed particularly unfriendly.
Yeah, it is. It's tough the way the city's traffic and roadways have been kind of developed around a kind of 19th century. It's kind of like Boston was, where it was the cowpath mode of design. Yeah, you follow where the cows go instead of really designing it the way it's easier to move around. Then they got into the big dig to avoid all of it. And so I don't see that happening here. But so this should be very interesting. One thing that they apparently are doing in Connecticut is complete streets, which is that how a street should work for both pedestrians and cyclists, bicyclists, as well as automobiles, and to calm traffic and so forth. But the state apparently, 95% of the state roads, that is, where the state has some ownership, 95% of those, as they redo them, repave them, they're putting bike lanes in. So that's kind of a
So maybe there's some hope for like Bank Street or some of...
Maybe we could just put all the streets into the state's hand. They don't do such a bad job, frankly, with some of the streets they've got. Not all, but...
It just seems like encouraging bicycling would be such a great way to take advantage of the fact that we have a very small footprint in our city.
Right.
From Ocean Beach to Conn College might be 6 miles.
Right.
And that isn't a very daunting bike ride if we can make it a comfortable bike ride.
Right. I know there's been talk about having bike rack, where you can, I don't know if it's a rental per se or if it's a deposit and you get your deposit back, but sites located, one being Ocean Beach, the other one up near the Coast Guard, maybe Hodges Square, but certainly downtown near the train station and what have you, so that it would be, throughout the city where people could just hop on a bike. But of
Yeah.
course, you need to have the infrastructure to support
Right.
that people feel comfortable with. And how to make that happen. I mean, there are ways to do that, and we have many cities that have gone before us. So, hopefully we can learn from that. But we've got some great people on that who've done a lot of work. One woman who heads up Bike New Haven comes from Detroit, where she did a lot of work there, bicycling. I think people will find this really. I think it's nice to get some folks from another city in who are maybe a few paces ahead of us, and can share their ideas, and hopefully we can take those and run with some of it. And
Okay, so there's food.
yeah, then there's lunch.
Yeah, well, I was thinking food security. Not
Well, there's
just,
housing first.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if
start
that's
with-
in the order, but housing will come, and I facilitate that. But basically, this is everything from co-housing and community land trusts. We have a woman coming down from actually the Schumacher Center up in
Oh,
Great
nice.
Barrington. And they have a very mature community land trust, which was started years and years ago, and probably one of the first. I think actually Martin Luther King was around this area a little bit, and this became a really big thing to try to re-enfranchise people who, particularly African Americans. But this model will be presented, and then how preservation also helps to provide affordable housing stock will be touched on, and then and how we're planning and doing transition of homeless people into housing. So I think we try to cover the full gambit there of really another crisis, which is, do we have enough affordable housing for people? And we don't, and that's a big issue. So these people are all going to speak to that, and
Great.
so we'll see how that all goes. And then we have food. Food is our biggest. Well, food encompasses a lot of things. It's a primary energy source, and obviously it touches on health and all the rest of this. But the Hartford Food Systems will facilitate this, and we have everything from a woman who does regenerative farming, which is something different states. There was a piece in the New York Times Magazine on regenerative farming, which is really something. And it helps to re-sequester carbon, because farming creates a huge amount when you till soil, particularly in large agribusinesses, where carbon is released into the atmosphere. This is a way to bring the carbon back into the soil, but also produce. And so things like no-till farming, and she'll talk to that. And then we have a community, some community garden farming, but school-related, so getting kids tied back in, much like Fresh, only this is not Fresh per se, but same model. And then we have there's a place up in, I think, Milford, and it's called Trifecta Ecosystems. And they have something that I was interested in, as you may remember, that is, to have a ecosystem, aquaponic systems,
Oh, right.
hydroponic, but particularly the aquaponics. But they have really taken this much, much further than I had ever taken it. But they're really serious about it. And it's a young business, but they seem to be doing pretty well. So they'll be talking about farming year-round in a place like Connecticut. And then we get into Lexa Jury. I think
Oh,
she's
yeah,
been on
from-
the show, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
Fiddleheads.
she had. Lexa has been
Yeah.
on.
So she will talk to it from a retail wholesale buying from local producers, and last but not least is Click, which is the commercial kitchen. They do all kinds of training. They work a lot with farmers in processing food, so that it's licensed and it can be sold to Fiddleheads and others. So it's kind of soup to nuts on the on that whole food panel. Then the day ends with two speakers. One of them pretty well known to this area, which is Brian Kent, who's done a lot of work. The Hygienic Art Park is one example, but I think he's done things we don't even know half the time.
Everyone passes the parking lot on Eugene O'Neill as well.
There you go. He designed that as well. So he's definitely a major person. Him and Frost. And Brad, is it Brad Frost?
I'll
I'm not
think
sure.
about it. No, it isn't. Chad.
Chad, that's it. Sounds like.
Yes.
But he
you're
did
right.
the design for Mitchell College. He did some of the work, particularly Mitchell Woods and so forth. So anyway, Brian's going to talk about examples throughout the state as well as other parts of the country and how they brought back areas that were really, brownfields and so forth. So that's going to be a really interesting talk. And it won't be in this exact order, but Peter Minuti, who's with UConn and who helped us and did some work with Riverside Park.
Yeah, and just the reconnecting.
Yes. Yeah.
Hodges Square area.
Hodges Square. And Peter's great. And Peter had an assignment here in New London, CIRCA, which is a resiliency, it seems like it's tied to UConn anyway. And Peter did a lot of study with a team on Bank Street and Water Street in terms of sea level rising. And so he's going to be presenting
that's
that
great.
at this. So we'll get a better sense of what's it looking like. We got how much land and when are we going to start losing things and how do we deal with that? Or is it maybe a little better than we think or whatever? But he'll speak to that with the latest data they have on this area. So I'm very pleased to know that the city is starting to take this seriously, and we all grow up here and we see the water and we just think it's the way it always was, and it's really not. It's changed, and I think this will be a great way to get everybody involved in thinking about it.
Now, for people who want to register for this,
Yes.
there are still a few spaces left.
Oh, sure. We can always we always have room for 1, 2, 3, 4 more. We are doing quite well on the registration. I will say a lot of the registration is, it's up on the screen, tvsci.org, and you just Google that and go to the homepage and click on symposium registration, and that'll bring you to the calendar and so forth, and then you can just simply register. It is $35 to register.
It includes lunch.
And
though,
it
right?
includes lunch, and it's been, it'll be locally catered, and I think some great learning. Now, we are seeing that a lot of, we've got a good New London contingency coming to this, but we also have people as far as New York. Sarah Lawrence is a person who just signed up today from Sarah Lawrence in New York City, and so we're finding people are coming from throughout the state because this is kind of a one place, one spot. Usually you go and you see a presentation on a topic like sea level rising or health or whatever, but everybody will see everything. So we're not breaking out into different groups. where you miss some of it. Geez, I wanted to go to both of those, but they're at the same time. So everybody will be there. It's a nice. Anybody who hasn't been to the Lyme and Allen,
It's a nice facility.
please. This is a nice way, and they've got, I think, an interesting exhibit. So even though there may not be time during the day to see that exhibit, please go back there and check those out. They've done a lot with that museum in terms of keeping it very fresh and eclectic.
So, I hate to say it, we only have about 10 minutes. So, what I wanted to ask you about, because it's getting to be that season, are the farmers markets that have been overseen by Thames Valley Sustainable Connections for several years now.
Yes, yeah. Well, we're heading into, I don't know even what season, how many, but a number of years. And so our markets will start in July. We learned that if you really want to have a harvest, you have to wait till July. I'm hoping that more of this year-round stuff will start to, get things moving earlier. But we have 3 markets, one on Tuesday, which is not a New London market, but the city of Groton in Washington Park. And that starts July 3rd, and it goes to the end of October, October 30th. And so it'll be every Tuesday, rain or shine, unless we have, another Sandy come through. And on Wednesdays, we're back at L&M. We were there last year for only a month.
Yeah, it was either started late or was sporadic.
Yeah, we started late, and there really is a whole different group of people that don't necessarily make their way up to Williams Park as much as we'd like to think that everybody, little city. But on Friday, and that'll be from July 11th, because the first Wednesday in July is the 4th, so we're not going to do that. So July 11th will be the first one.
And that's in that parking lot on the other side of Montauk Avenue, where it's been in the
The
past,
L&M,
right?
yeah.
The L&M one.
Yeah. Yeah, in that nice little field. Used to be bigger, now it's smaller, but it's still a pretty good spot. Nice trees, shade. And then on Fridays, we'll be at Williams Park near Dunkin' Donuts on Broad Street, and that'll be July 6th through October 26th. The other thing I'll mention, we'll have a lot of your favorite farmers and all kinds of, food-oriented products. We have usually a book nook, so local authors come as well. We have music at all the markets. Some musicians now have their own built-in, they can battery run amplifiers, so they don't need to plug in. And so we're going to see some of that at L&M where we don't have any power. But there is something too, along with the different activities, and there'll be more promotion of this, is a senior voucher bonus. We got a grant, it's called a Sphere grant, from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture. Now this grant happened because last year the General Assembly, as we may recall, could not pass a budget, which meant that last year seniors had no vouchers. So that was a real hardship for people. These are people who really need to have that supplement. And there were no vouchers for them last year. We did have the women, infant, children vouchers. So what they were able to do is take that money and move it forward to this year. So we double those vouchers.
Great.
So if you have a $3 voucher, we give you an extra $3, and that means $6 you can spend at the market for vegetables and fruits and honey. And those are the products that the voucher works for. But it's really, really nice, and it'll really help support our farmers And so we're excited, but also this is something that's going to be promoted through the Senior Center. TVCCA will probably do a lot of promotion of it as well.
Is the senior center going to be able to have a bus to the Friday market, or is that up in the air?
Didn't I read something about they are not hiring the bus driver anymore
I don't
because
know.
of budgets?
I'm not up on that.
I don't know if that's
It's
true
not
enough.
far, but
Well, we actually, I think when we were last year, Ledgelight had gotten a grant, and included in that grant was actually pay for a bus driver. But it's one thing to have a bus and a bus driver, but then you need people that sign up to go. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, even in Groton where we had it, we did get a few people, but not that many. And so it's a great idea. We were hoping one time to actually get a bus that would just pick people up at different places and bring them, not just from a senior center, but, in any case, no.
I thought for the future.
Yeah, maybe we'll find a way to make that work. But that's the market, and that's coming up again in July. And
Now, I know that a few years ago, because people buy fresh foods at the market, but being able to preserve them is an issue.
Yeah.
Now, do you still have canning classes?
yes.
Available?
We have one coming up, and I think it has, I want to say pickling, but I may have the term wrong. But yes, we've been doing pretty much on a monthly basis. We started the year off with making pasta, and that went over very well. And then jam last month, and I think it's pickling coming up. And yeah, Amelia Smith is a great instructor, and we do this at St. James Church. We have a class, and I just didn't write that down, so I don't remember exactly when it is. These are generally on Saturday from 1 to 3.
And usually it's using whatever kind of produce is prevalent that time of year.
Exactly.
So I kind of remember that in September or October, there's often been something on applesauce or apple butter.
Exactly. So as we get further along, we'll have tomato canning and sauces and stuff like that when the tomatoes come out. So absolutely, it's always freshly harvested, and Amelia is able to, she's a good buyer. She purchases, she gets some good pricing, but she also gets fresh produce locally. So yeah, that's a nice thing to add to what we do.
Well, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I wanted to ask you just really briefly to talk about why it's important to support local businesses.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, if I can quickly.
You have like 3 minutes.
3 minutes. I'll just say that $1 equals $3. It multiplies, and it really is a multiplier because local business will, I don't know. Yeah. Local businesses do local buying too. So when you're looking for your accountant, your banker, your advertising is all going to be locally done if you're rooted locally. If you're a big box, a percentage of what comes into that leaves the area entirely, and if they're headquartered in Arkansas, as Walmart's happens to be, then that money never recirculates.
So any of those administrative functions are just far, far away.
Right. All of that, they do economies of scale, which is why the big things, that has been a mantra for so long, economies of scale, that, geez, if we scale it up, then we can reduce costs. But there's a lot of loss in that, in that gain. So that's the simple thing is for every $1 spent locally, you multiply, and it creates $3 as a rule of thumb. We have a directory, a brand new one coming out. We're going to have some at the symposium.
Oh, good.
And so we're excited about that. They always look nice, and it's kind of a one of a kind. There is no other directory of our local businesses here. Per se,
And the last question, if people want to get involved or be supportive of the organization, where do they go for information?
Well, if they just want to take a look at everything, then I would say go to that same website of tvsci.org, or they can give me a call. I'd be more than happy to talk to folks and see how they might want to be involved. There are other things. Hodges Square Village is another, and we didn't get to that.
Everything.
But there are other things we do here, and we'd love to hear from people, and there may be things we'd be more than happy to partner with people on.
Well, thank you, Art. I hope to see you all at the symposium on Thursday, and we will see you next week.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.